And the best person to talk to about that and more, and all things handicapping, he'll be delighted to know, is the ex-head handicapper at the BHA and now co-chair of the World's Best Racehorse Rankings Committee. Did I get that right, Phil Smith?
Absolutely bang on, Tom.
I'm delighted with that. Good. So you were there on Wednesday, of course you were. How much, Phil, welcome to the show, how much goes into the decision making? When is it that you all, as a committee, come together and start to see where you are with the ranking?
Okay, so it's an ongoing process throughout the year. So every time a pattern race is run anywhere in the world, it goes on we have an interactive computer system. The race is downloaded. For example, the 2 races in America last night will have been downloaded this morning. And the various handicappers around the world have an opportunity to put their figures on. You can see what other people think. You can make your own mind up. And then they'll get sort of changed slightly as the year goes on, as the form works out or it doesn't work out. And then we meet in Hong Kong for 7 days in the early December, during the time of the international races. And we argue it out, basically. So, for example...
When you say we, how many nations, how many different people?
There's around 20. Okay. So you can imagine 20 handicappers, all with pretty strong opinions. It takes a bit of managing. That's my job nowadays. I'm the sort of neutral co-chairman now, which is great. And we argue it out. Basically, what happens is, for example, on Voltgeist, the French handicapper would state his case for Voltgeist. The English handicapper would state his case for Enable and Crystal Ocean. Previous years, the Australian handicapper would state his case for Winx. There would be questions, there would be different opinions, and eventually it would come to a vote.
Now, I'm interested by that. Is it a case of you mentioned the French handicapper, the British handicapper, Australian handicapper, are they effectively batting for a side?
Well, they're batting for what they believe is the correct opinion or assessment of themselves, because they will have presumably, certainly in Britain, we would have always had quite a lot of meetings within the team and discussions on the phone before we ever went to Hong Kong, and we would have already discussed it with every sort of handicapping team in GB. So that's the first process, and then they come and they say, OK, this is what I think this horse should be, and they would state the case as to why. So are they batting for them? They're stating the case for the figure that they believe is right for their horse.
And you as an individual, have you ever had your mind changed as a result of a discussion? Because watching and knowing racing internationally as you do, you must go in there with a preconceived idea of what's going to happen. Have you found that in perhaps this year or in past years, somebody said something and you've gone, actually, I will just adjust that?
Absolutely. And that's the whole purpose of it. If you go in with a closed mind, there's no point in having it. You may as well just have a vote straight away. So that the whole purpose is to discuss it, and other people will take perhaps a different view. And you absolutely have to consider it and make your mind up at the end before you start to vote.
There were 3 horses at the top. Of course, there were more horses involved in it, and there was a top 10 as well. We can have a look at that. You had Enable, Valgeist and Crystal Ocean, then Beauty Generation, Batash, Lise Gracieux, Gaiath, Vina Rosso, Winx, Glorivaz and Ben Battle in there. I suppose I'm most interested in the fact that you couldn't split 3 at the top, Enable, Valgeist and Crystal Ocean, whose form all tied in with each other. First question. The world's best racehorse, Longines world's best, horse race. I'm doing a Matt Chapman. The world's best horse race, not racehorse, was the Qatar Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe.
Sure.
Therefore, why wasn't Valgeist winner of that race the world's best racehorse?
OK. Well, first of all, the race itself, for example, the Arc, that's an arithmetical exercise. So basically, once we come up with our figures at the end of the meeting in Hong Kong, what someone then will do is they'll look at the first 4 in the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe, they'll look at their ratings, they'll add them all up and divide by 4, and that's the rating given for the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe. And it's the way all pattern races are assessed around the world. So in terms of when races get promoted and relegated, it's based on the average of the first 4 home. So and that's common throughout the world. So that's an arithmetical process, whereas the world's best race horse as opposed to race, is much more analytical. You will compare form, and it has been the case in the past that we've been unable to separate two horses a few years ago. We couldn't separate. So it has happened before. It's the first time there's ever been three at the top together, but there's been a number of occasions where there's been 3 on 128. There's 3 on 128 this year, just happened to be the best. But there's been a number of occasions where there's been 3 on 128. I was interested in looking at your caption there. There's about 9 on 126. And it's very, very difficult to separate them. We've assessed something like 300 and odd horses, and they go from 128 to 115. So there's always a lot of horses on the same rating.
Does it feel a little bit less satisfactory, or are you frustrated when you can't find one? I'm not saying it's wrong at all. I understand how you come to the decision, but do you go into it with the ambition or the hope you can find one?
No, you do what you think is right, and if it happens that 2 come out the same or 3 come out the same, then so be it. You have to go through the process and not prejudge things. So, my job is just to ensure fair play, make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak, and then my last major job is when there's a tied vote, I have a casting vote. And that was taken not on any of those horses, but I had a casting vote on 9 horses this time. So that's the only time I get involved in the voting now that I'm a neutral. So no, I don't think we do that. If it comes out that the best 3 are all equal, then so be it. I haven't really got a problem with that. The one thing I would say is I think that all 3 of them were slightly unlucky in a different way, in that the quality of the 3-year-olds that they came up against this year was, without question, the lowest that we've ever had. The highest rated 3-year-old is Sotsas, and he's on 123. So you get higher ratings when you run against higher rated horses and they push each other onwards and upwards. So I think it was slightly unlucky for all 3 of those. For me, potentially, I think they were probably all 3 better than 128, but the way that races have occurred, they really didn't have the opportunity to show how much better they were, and I think a really good, strong batch of 3-year-olds would have pushed them onwards and upwards, and they would have been maybe 29 or 30, and maybe then we could have been able to differentiate between them. Because you have to remember that if you look at the results of these 3 horses, they all did beat each other at various different times.
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, if you're looking this as and it's not a commercial venture per se, but if you're looking at it commercially, and I explain to so and so down the whatever, oh, you remember Enable beat Crystal Ocean in the King George? Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, they're both the world's best racehorse. He said, what? Well, that's not. But of course, that was the on-running argument into the race, that he was rated higher than her. But that's the mare's allowance, which you have to measure.
On that race, he comes out the better horse.
On the King George.
On the King George, he comes out the better horse because he's given her £3 and she's beaten him a neck. So that's his best performance. But it's not necessarily her best performance.
So you have to. There's no sort of personal opinion on how easily she did it, or what the ground was that day.
There is a value judgment on that, and actually, I think most of the handicappers, instead of calling the neck £1, I think a lot of the handicappers call the neck £2, because if you look at the last 50 yards, she was always holding him, and it wasn't an absolutely, thrashed out, all out neck. So actually, when you take the fillies allowance in, pretty well everybody had him on 128 and her on 127 in that race. But we found out that we could get a higher in a different race. The key principle to always remember is the rankings are a horse's best sustainable performance. So can you prove it? Was it sustained? And it can be sustained in 2 ways, either by the horse itself or by the horses that it finished alongside. So very often, in fact, it was a few years ago, where a horse didn't actually replicate it itself, but the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th all did. And so we still gave that horse the accolade of a particular rating. So it's a little bit more complex than adding 4 figures up and dividing by 4.
Mm. I'm interested as to where you stand on the filly's allowance, the mare's allowance as is, because of course we go into every year in the Cat Up Riddle Triumph and say, well, where's the 3-year-old filly, because she's going to be getting £9, and they do have a very good record in it. Mm-hmm. You at your time in the BHA made changes to the weight for age scale while you were there. I think both flat and jumps. Is that right? Sure. I mean, are you happy with the fillies allowance as it stands on the flat?
Well, the fillies allowance isn't a handicapper's decision. That's taken by individual jurisdictions. You know, so people different from me believe whether the filly should or shouldn't have an allowance, and it varies from all over the world. For example, it's £3 here, but if you go to lots of the Southern Hemisphere countries, it's 2 kilos, which is 4.4. And I did notice last night in America it was £5. So it varies, you know, from everywhere around the world.
What do you believe is the right one, if you like?
I believe in a perfect world, in Group 1s, I wouldn't give the fillies allowance at all. That's just a personal view. But I totally accept why they do, because the great thing that it provides is that they run against the boys, and it adds to our excitement. So, you know, they're seduced into the race by a sex allowance. And as a result, we've had the benefit of Zarkava, Zenyatta, Winx, etc., Enable. Would those horses have run in those all-aged, all-sex Group 1s without the fillies allowance? And I suspect the answer is probably no. So the individual jurisdictions around the world, they've made a decision that fillies should get a sex allowance in Group 1s. And from a personal point of view, I wouldn't, but I totally understand why they do so. But in terms of actually looking at the intrinsic merit of a horse, we have to take that into account.
Mm. Whether it exists whether it's fair within the confines of that race itself, it acts as an incentive for connections to, not necessarily perhaps in the Arc, because you might find that fillies go for it no matter, because it's the Arc. But some of those other Grade 1s, I take the point.
Sure. And if you look across the board, if you look at the average filly in Britain, and if you look at sort of maidens and races like that, you know, the fillies really cannot compete without a sex allowance. But I think at the very, very top level, I think the horses I've just gone through, they would show you that they absolutely can at the very, very top level. But overall, if you look at the whole fillies population as a whole, they need the sex allowance, and some of them need a darn sight more than 3, 4 or 5. Mm.
There were a few things in your 23 years at the BHA and in your 13 years as head of handicapping?
12.
12? Yeah. That you did make some changes. The weight for age you changed. And also at the turn of the century, the Anglo-Irish ratings, you brought those together. Why did you feel that those two things were important to be changed?
OK. Well, first of all, weight for age. I mean, I started handicapping jumpers in the end of '98, beginning of '99, and it quickly became apparent that imports from France, 4-year-old imports from France, were winning a disproportionate number of races. So it became pretty obvious. So I gathered statistics over a year. I went to the BHA, to the Race Planning Committee. I put forward the case and suggested a change. And initially, I think a lot of trainers were pretty unhappy with that change. But I think what's happened over time is now it's bedded in, is that I think most people realise that was actually a pretty straightforward decision to make. So that was that one. The weight for age on the flat, I think, was driven, particularly here and also in Ireland, by an amazing success rate of 3-year-olds in handicaps in the second half of the season. Mm-hmm. July onwards, you know, you only need to look at the results, and the percentage chance of a 3-year-old winning a handicap against older horses from July onwards was increasing and increasing.
Isn't it still there, particularly in that July-August period?
It is. So really, in a sense, you've justified my decision, because you've said there, is it still there? It is, but it's not as bad as it was. Okay. So I think that was one reason. The process was interesting, because I did a lot of work with, first of all, my team at the time, and particularly Dominic Gardner-Hill, who's now in charge, and we came up with our figures. Then we spoke to Gary O'Gorman, handicapper in Ireland, and Gary and I came up with, in a sense, a joint idea, which we put to both Britain and Ireland. But that's only halfway. You then got to put it to France, to Germany and Italy, because the 5 countries are the main European patent committees, and you couldn't have a situation where you have a different weight for age in Ireland and a different weight for age in Italy, and trainers would just be jumping and ducking and diving to get the best allowance for them. So that was quite a process, and then within all those countries, all the stakeholders had to be come on side. So did I get everything I wanted in the reduction of the weight for age scale in Britain 4 or 5 years ago? No, I didn't, and neither did Gary, because it was modified by race courses and by trainers and by owners. So it was slightly, the effects of it were slightly less dramatic than I was hoping.
Did you must have expected that?
Of course, yes, because that's just the way of the world, isn't it? You know, and what's great about racing, but also sometimes frustrating about racing, is that everybody has an opinion about anything to do with handicapping. And it was interesting during the time, 4 or 5 years ago, when Gary and I were trying to change the weight for age. It was amazing the number of people who suddenly became experts on weight for age.
And to move on to the, and I forget its correct name, the Anglo-Irish
Jumps classification.
Jumps classification.
Sure.
That is, when is that decided each and every year?
Okay. Well, that started at the turn of the century with myself and Noel O'Brien, who was the head of jumping in Ireland at the time, and we sort of came together, and at that time there was an international flat classification, and we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting at the end of the year to do a jumps one? We just thought it might be a bit of fun for the two of us to do, really, which we did. We offered the opportunity for France to join, and they didn't want to join, so it just became an Anglo-Irish as opposed to a European system. And we started it in 99, and it's carried on ever since. And I think that's been really interesting, and now it's got 20 years of history, so it's brilliant.
But and that is to really establish who the best, you come out with a bell, maybe you have more than one, but the best horse is at the end of the year. But it doesn't mean that throughout the year you have continuity between the different marks over in Ireland and the marks when they come over to the UK.
Absolutely. You generally find that above 140, which is the cut-off point for the Anglo-Irish Jumps classification, the British and Irish systems get closer and closer together. You know, we're often maybe only £1 or £2 different at the very top level. But what we agreed to, and again, we worked on best sustainable performance, not necessarily their current handicap marks, because obviously, you know, horses decline at a certain point, you know, and the horse might have been well beaten in his last 3 or 4 races, but his run in November still stacked up when you looked at the 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th. So we used exactly the same principle, and we put it out at the end of the year, and I think it's been a point of interest for people. We
are going to talk more about the Anglo-Irish side of things, but in talking points, you'll be pleased to know that is going to come up. Eddie O'Leary was quite vocal recently about Dallas de Picton and the mark he's been given with regard to coming back over here. But just to type where you are at the moment, you of course, what are we, 2 years that you stepped
about a year
down?
and a half now, yeah.
It was great fun seeing you at Cheltenham yesterday. I didn't manage to have a word with you because I saw on 2 occasions I wanted to have a word with you. There were 2 trainers who shall remain nameless having a chat with you, and I felt like saying, lads, he stopped, it's okay, he stepped down. But they looked as though they were trying to persuade you with regard to something.
No, they were all great. We were just having a general chat, but although I went on New Year's Day and a trainer who I wouldn't have a massive number of horses came up to me and berated me about a horse, unaware that I'd retired in July 2018, and that was quite entertaining.
Did you, I think we paint the picture of you're the bad guy with regards to the trainers, because I'm sure it's very rare somebody said thank you, but did you find that some were understood your position and were generally quite good at accepting the mark that they've been given?
I think the one thing I tried to do right from the start was communicate with the trainers. We set up, as part of the way that trainers now get a licence, there's a handicappers session as part of the 3-module course, which they have to take before they get their licence. That's a 3.5-hour session on a Friday morning. Was with me in Newmarket, so I just bored them into submission, basically, as a result of that. But the great thing it did is it did establish a rapport and a relationship and an understanding on their side as to how the handicappers actually work. So I think communication. I encourage trainers to call me to debate. I much prefer trainers to call me if they're not happy than go straight to the Racing Post. I think that personally is unedifying. I don't think it's good for the trainers. I don't think it's good for the handicappers. And but obviously the Racing Post love it because everybody loves a good row. So I much prefer to try and settle any of those issues quietly on the phone.
And do you think, and we talk about this with the BHA as a whole, with regards to individuals working there with regards to this background, from a handicapping perspective, do you think in any way it's important to have somebody there that has dealt hands-on with horses, perhaps worked in racing and ridden in racing, or should that not come into it from your point of view?
Well, I think it's if the right person for the job has got ability or has had knowledge with horses in the past, then it's got to be a plus, of course. But I wouldn't suddenly, if somebody was perhaps not the best candidate, I wouldn't pick them just because they'd got knowledge of horses. I mean, one of the best handicappers who I appointed was Chris Nash, who used to be assistant trainer to Nick Littenden. And he's been a huge help to me and as a top handicapper and respected by everybody.
Subscribe to Racing TV to be notified when more Luck on Sunday videos are appearing online. And don't forget to join me for the show every Sunday morning from 9 o'clock with the best guests.